I'm going to start the. So, okay. So we're going to start off by taking a look at a interview of the Polish ambassador to the United States. And in particular, this was on NPR, so National Public Radio. And so let me do that. Where did he disappear to? Where is this guy now? It should be here somewhere. Where's my Polish ambassador? Okay, there we are. Okay. So he's saying that Polish ambassador warns of a prolonged war in Ukraine and calls for more support. So what I want you to think about this is severalfold. One, the economic impact that it will have on the world and on Russia and Ukraine, but also he talks about immigration, a very interesting perspective on immigration, which I think he probably should not have really talked about, but he does. So we'll see what he has to say. So you should be seeing the ambassadors, the page with the ambassador. There you go. I don't know why IT is a little bit slow here, but we'll deal with it. So let's see what he has to say here in this interview. And the way that he views the world is very interesting.
Allies of Ukraine are preparing for a second year of war. The anniversary of Russia's invasion is later this month. This means a second year of war for neighboring Poland, which has sent arms and aid to Ukraine. Poland's ambassador to the U.S. is Marek Magorowski.
We had several discussions among EU ambassadors here in Washington whether we should start talking about a clash of civilizations, not the one described by Samuel Huntington in his famous book, but another clash of cultures between Russia and Europe, or between Russia and the West, or between Russia and the free world.
Poland was ruled by Russia in generations.
So this is an element of deglobalization, right? That Paul is talking about, the emergence of conflicts and disruptions that are taking place.
Faced now with Russian aggression, it has taken a larger role in urging Europe to resist. Poland last month pressured neighboring Germany to send advanced battle tanks to Ukraine, and Germany eventually did. Poland has sent some of its own military hardware across the border. Ambassador Magorowski says Ukraine needs more support to win this war, even though Russia has fought badly.
We tended to overestimate Russia's military might before the war, but I'm afraid we are now underestimating it.
What do you mean?
I'm not terribly optimistic about the course of this war. I think it will be a protracted conflict, if not a frozen one. I believe Putin can still flood Ukraine with manpower or cannon fodder, if you will. The Russian society and especially the Russian ruling elites are much more resilient than us, than the West. It will take time, and it will take a very serious and long-term effort also on our side.
What does a protracted conflict mean?
So what is he talking about here in terms of the resiliency of the Russian elite? Part of it is the isolation of the Russian decision makers from the population, given its political system, right? In other words, the governmental officials have a high degree of insulation and autonomy from society, and is in fact quite isolated, right, from opposition, and opposition groups have been, and dissidents have been imprisoned, exiled, or in some cases assassinated. So that's why they have that resilience. The resilience here refers to the staying power of the Russian elite. They can continue this war for the foreseeable future. So protracted war, or even what he later on calls a frozen situation, that this may last 10, 20 years.
Poland, given that your country has already become a home for, I believe, millions of refugees.
Since the beginning of the war, more than 9 million Ukrainian refugees have crossed the border with Poland. Of course, not all of them stayed in our country. Some of them emigrated to other countries in Europe. Some of them returned to Ukraine, but roughly 1.5 million refugees did remain in our country. They enjoy many benefits. Just a month after the war, the Polish parliament passed a law which essentially facilitates their integration into Polish society, and they do integrate seamlessly. impeccably into the Polish labor market, for example. And I believe this is our, not only a political, but also a personal obligation for many Poles to help out.
So it's kind of interesting. What is he saying here? Right? Think about what he's saying for a second. What he's saying is that the Polish economy has to have a strategy of integrating the 1.5 million Ukrainians that move to the country. But it's not just an economic integration, it's also a cultural integration into the country and a social integration into the country. And he's saying that Ukrainians have impeccably assimilated, and Polish, Polish citizens have assisted in that assimilation process. That's very different than what you have in Canada, notion of multicultural society, and where the United States is evolving. The idea here is that they will become ultimately Ukrainian, right? And I want you to pay attention later on when he talks about refugees from, say, Syria or the Middle East. The way he categorizes them, very interesting and revealing.
Ukrainian brethren.
Poland has not always been as welcoming to refugees. There was much political frustration over refugees from the Middle East, for example. What makes it easier to contemplate millions of Ukrainians in your midst for a very long time?
As I said, they integrate into the Polish society extraordinarily. They have a similar cultural background and a religious background as well, which is of, I believe, of critical importance.
So what religious background is he talking about here? It's very interesting because Poland is primarily Catholic, right? And Ukraine is predominantly Eastern Orthodox. So in a broad sense, notion of Christianity, you can you see that, but it's not the same. Very different. Very different.
They learn the language in another month. And about 95% of those refugees are women and children, because we both know what the Ukrainian men are doing right now. And those women, upon arrival in Warsaw or in Krakow or in Gdańsk, they never say, I want welfare. They never say, I want an allowance. I want the Polish authorities to take care of myself and of my family. They always say, I want a job. Handing.
So you see what he's saying here. He's essentially accusing the refugees, from Syria as coming there primarily for economic reasons, or at least seeking to benefit economically in terms of the provisions of the state. And whereas compared to the Ukrainians migrate for the purpose of their political situation, but they want to work. I think these stereotypes are very dangerous and very, I would say, quite, culturally biased.
Because fortunately, the unemployment rate in Poland is now ridiculously low.
The ambassador's remarks there reflect long-standing views of Poland's ruling party and also widespread European resistance to migrants in years past. More recently, Russia's allies took advantage of that sensitivity, sending Middle Eastern migrants to Poland's border. The reception for Ukrainians has been very different.
It would be unfair to compare these two crises, if you will, and the Polish authorities' conduct in these two cases.
If your side prevails, what does a post-war Europe look like?
It is my firm belief that now the whole world, and especially our European partners, have understood how important the Eastern flank is in terms of deterrence. Deterrence is key. And that's why, for example, we have been trying for months to convince our American partners that we need a permanent presence on Polish soil. We need more American troops. And we do believe, unlike some other politicians in Western Europe, that we still need America as a military hegemon in this part of the world, in Europe. And I can only echo the words of the Finnish Prime Minister, who said just a few weeks ago that without America, we would be in a completely different situation now in Europe.
As many people will know, in the Cold War, Germany was the front line against the Soviet Union, and the United States developed a whole network of bases in Germany, many of which are still operating and very important to the United States. I think I hear you saying that if the US had more bases in Poland, closer to Russia, that would be fine with you.
Absolutely. Yes, of course. We are a frontline state with or without American bases because it's about geography. Russia has always been our neighbor. It is our neighbor, and it will remain so. It will not vanish.
Ambassador, thanks very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Marek Magorowski is Poland's ambassador to the United States.
And that
All right.
Allies of Ukraine are preparing for a
Hold on. All right. So he makes some really interesting comments, right? I mean, he talks about immigration, really stereotypical view of people from Syria and the Middle East. And at the same time talks about he would welcome permanent American bases. You can see why Russia would be quite alarmed by such a statement like this, right? So I thought that was a very interesting, a willingness to integrate relatively quickly Ukrainian refugees, yet resistance to integrating refugees from the Middle East. So I wanted to kind of share that with everyone, right? As a way of thinking about the way that international relations operate and its linkage to migration, immigration, right? And geopolitics, in particular, talking about the U.S. troop presence in Poland, permanent bases. And there are only 2 countries in the world that currently have bases outside of their country. And that is the United States and China. China has a base in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. Right? Great Britain has bases, but those bases are in colonies, such as Falkland Islands, as an example. Right? So he's actively calling for bases, American bases in Poland. I found that to be quite interesting. Okay. Any comments or any thoughts about that? I thought it was quite provocative when I heard it a few weeks ago, and I wanted to share it with everyone. Okay. All right, so we take a look at our notes here. Right? We know everybody can see that. So this is very interesting here, right? So when we talk about political economy, what we're talking about is the linkage between politics and economics, and that the 2 are actually related to each other. So there's a field, a formal field called political economy, and there are graduate programs that focus on political economy. Now, let's take a look, and in particular in the context of globalization. So this examines growth of global exports. So total world exports adjusted for inflation. So they're using a constant price from 1913. Right? So, well, what does that mean, you say? So let's say here's 1913. Okay. Anything before 1913 has to be inflated upwards to 1913 prices. Everything after 1913 has to be deflated to the value of the dollar. So what do we see here? It's very interesting to note the dramatic increase, right? Which really happened after World War II, is where you see this exponential curvilinear growth. We'll talk about this part later on. Okay. This is a product of the globalization and increased interdependence, right, in an economic sense. So the WTO, well, and its predecessor, in part, the GATT, but also International Monetary Fund and World Bank, playing a central role in terms of promoting a liberalized international trade and finance regime. Right. So what's a regime? A regime is set of laws, rules, procedures, and norms agreed upon as a framework for particular issue areas. So let me repeat that again. A regime is a set of norms, rules, laws, expectations. So in there will be treaties also that set the framework for particular issue areas. So trade is an issue area. Finance is an issue area. Migration is an issue area. And environment is an issue area. So around each of those, you have a set of rules, procedures, norms, and treaties and laws that have emerged. So in the context of political economy, emphasizing globalization, and in particular, the liberal ideas of trade and finance has led to an explosion of trade, global exports. Right? There is even an index called the Index of Openness, which is exports plus imports over the entire economy, as a fraction, right? It's a relationship. So what percentage of imports and export is a country's economy? The higher the amount of imports and exports, the more integrated it is into the global economy. That's that basic premise of that particular statistic. So, with the various, what they call trade rounds, GATT trade rounds, GATT is General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Right? They would negotiate in rounds, like the Tokyo rounds, the Uruguay rounds, etc. And the idea is that they would tackle specific issue areas and eliminate those barriers to trade. Right? And so right now we're in the Doha, and it's become contentious. It has become contentious, right? And in what ways? One, the developing countries are asserting that they're not benefiting from global trade to the extent that developed countries are. There are major disagreements at this time on issues of agriculture and an area which they call GATS. That's general. It's a general agreement on traded services, as well as intellectual property. So this is what they're negotiating now, and it's been stuck quite a while. Right? It's called the Doha rounds being held in Qatar. And we're not seeing a dramatic increase in terms of global trade. Right? So the question becomes, is this a temporary situation, or is this a more protracted situation? Have we reached the peak or plateau, if you want to call it that, of global trade? So I can't answer that question. I think that the economist, Rabini, in the video clip, talks a little bit about this and how the global economy is stretched beyond the limit, right? So first key point that we should be aware of. Trade and finance are two sides of the same coin. Okay, both are required for global economic activity to thrive. Well, what does that mean? It means that they work in tandem with each other. The liberalization of trade also requires a liberalization of finance. Okay, and a liberalization of finance often follows after liberalization in trade. So what do we mean by liberalization in finance? That means that you move towards floating exchange rates and the convertibility of currency and the ability for money to be able to transcend national borders without severe governmental restrictions. But you see, after 9/11, there's been much more heightened scrutiny on, will end in 10 minutes. It's not supposed to end in 10 minutes. What's going on here? It has been upgraded. What's the problem here? Huh? Well, this is crazy stuff. It's definitely upgraded and paid for by me. Come on now. You can't make this stuff up. You know? Okay. Very strange. No, it should say it should work. I have it here. Next charge, the 25th. No, I don't know why. No, I have the license. I don't know what's going on. I hope we're not going to get cut off in 10 minutes. That would be really bad. Why is it doing this? You can't make this stuff up. I definitely have it. So why? Anyway, very odd. Okay. And so they're both required for global economic activity. The other point is economics and politics are integral to each other. You can't separate the two. That the public sector and the private sector work together. Okay, and that economics and politics, one doesn't cause the other, right? Rather, it is bi-directional. In other words, the arrows point both ways. Politics reinforces economics and vice versa. Right? It's important to keep that in mind. It's not a chicken and egg situation where one causes the other. It is rather a situation where we don't know exactly what the egg is and what the chicken is. So, want to talk a little bit about the modern world economy, based on the Bretton Woods institutions. The whole idea was to promote global trade and integration. That's part of globalization. And two entities are particularly important. One is the IMF, and the other one is the World Bank. Okay, they're both located in Washington, D.C. That, coupled with the tremendous influence that the United States government exerted, right, in the form of one, the hegemony after World War II, created a situation where the United States and its allies were able to construct an international economic system, which we call the Bretton Woods system. And because of the power of the United States in these institutions, it came to be known as the Washington Consensus, that there was an agreement on policies, open trade, open finances, reduce barriers to closed trade systems, and reduce barriers to the lack of ability for the free flow of currency. And that's what all the negotiations were about, by promoting a liberal economic order. Okay, we call it the liberal paradigm. So if you look at IMF, I want to get to their website here, and what they do. IMF is frequently called the lender of last resort. Okay, it's a lender of last resort. So share screen, lender of last resort. There we go. So we share that. Okay. So it provides technical assistance also. So governments can apply to the IMF for a loan. They also provide technical advice to countries in terms of dealing with macroeconomic issues, and to include things like budgeting, interest rates, things of that nature. Well, nowadays, the IMF's activity is increasingly integrated in with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Right, so let's take a look at how the IMF works.
Imagine a country emerging from decades of conflict. How does it begin rebuilding its economy and ensure opportunities for all its people? Or another country of 20 million people, but only 10% pay their taxes. Not enough taxpayers means not enough money for roads and hospitals. How does the government provide essential services to its people? These are the challenges the International Monetary Fund deals with every day. The IMF works with governments to modernize their economic policies and institutions and helps train their people. This helps countries strengthen their economies and create more jobs. By working with government agencies and staff, the IMF helps countries manage revenues and budgets, modernize banking and legal systems, improve economic analysis and forecasting, and enhance the reporting of macroeconomic data. For instance, when a new country, Kosovo, emerged from conflict, it had virtually no banks. With support from the government of Japan, the IMF worked with Kosovo to set up its central bank operations. This paved the way for commercial banks to provide basic financial services to people and businesses. When Liberia wanted to establish an efficient way to pay for public services, the IMF worked with the government to develop its tax policies, strengthen its taxpayer service programs, and support the establishment of the Liberia Revenue Authority. This supported the government's efforts to better endure the Ebola crisis. When government works well, people thrive. The IMF's work enables governments to provide better services such as schools, roads, and hospitals. It fosters a stable economic environment. And most importantly, it helps improve growth and create jobs.
Okay, so as you can see, why is it saying I only have 3 minutes left? What is going on? This thing has been upgraded. I may have to log right back in. This is craziness. I don't know what's going on, folks, but I'm gonna have to deal with that. Wow. Okay, but the important point of that is that, of course, the IMF has certain goals and objectives it's trying to accomplish, right? In particular, the goal and objectives that it's trying to accomplish is based on an ideology which we call liberalism, right? It's a liberal paradigm, if you want to call it that. As you can see, right, here we go. So this liberal paradigm is about opening up the economy, both in terms of trade, but also in terms of finance. Right? Okay. So what's the trends here? One, when it comes to fiscal and monetary policy, by fiscal and monetary policy, what we're specifically referring to is the idea of government spending. Fiscal is spending and revenues, and monetary supply refers to the supply of money, but also the interest rates. So what's the trend? The trend is towards a floating exchange rate. What's a floating exchange rate? When we talk about the monetary policy and finance, it means that the currency is actually, value is determined by international investors, right? Based on macroeconomic factors in a comparative way. That's the logic behind a floating currency. And at the same time, government also wants to make sure that there is no fiscal imbalance, and the IMF's responsibility is to make that happen, right? And that is done through policy advice. Okay. Let's see where we at here. So what the IMF does is they impose what's known as an IMF conditionality. In order to obtain loans when you are in trouble, governments have to abide by the rules set forth by the IMF. And that is the logic behind that. You know, that is IMF conditionality. And a lot of countries object to that. Now, I'm just making sure